Hello, everyone. Welcome to our CTMS event. We're just going to get underway in about a minute here. So we'll just ask you to hang tight as some other folks join the virtual event. All right, well, now that we've got 100 plus in the room with us here, I'd like to welcome you all formally to our informal event, which is Mennonites and Alcohol, a Historical Perspective. We're going to have a bit of a discussion this evening with myself, my co-director of the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies, Aileen Friesen, and the other three folks on the panel who I'll introduce in a second here. Before we get started, I want to begin with a territorial acknowledgement that at the University of Winnipeg here, we live and work on the ancestral and traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Inishnu, Assiniboine, Cree, Dakota, Dene peoples, and that Winnipeg is the heartland of the Métis Nation. I'll turn now to introducing the other folks in the room. So as I said, Aileen Friesen is my co-director here at the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies, or CTMS. And the other members of our panel are Sherry Klassen, Hans Werner, and Roland Sawatzky. Hello to all. Sherry Klassen holds a PhD in history and is active on Twitter as the Drunken Mennonite. That's where I first stumbled across her, and her brand new book is flying off the shelves. This is Menno-Nightcaps, cocktails inspired by the odd ethno-religious group you keep mistaking for the Amish, Quakers, or Mormons. The book includes soon-to-be classic cocktail recipes such as, I've got them dog-eared here, Hold a Manhattan, the Mutual Lemonade, and who could forget the Thrift Store Sour. So an exciting, invigorating read, an excellent mix of humor, and I must say, as someone who teaches surveys of Mennonite history, a pretty robust survey of Mennonite studies from origins to present day. I'm particularly excited about, as a Latin Americanist, a cocktail that involves a yerba mate infusion. So maybe we can get to that later. Another member of our group here, Hans Werner, is a colleague of Aileen and I's at the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies, where he is a senior scholar. He's published a number of books, including Imagined Homes and the Constructed Mennonite, and A Local History of Winkler, and he'll be discussing a bit about the use and regulation and response to alcohol in that location. And finally, we have Roland Sawatsky here. Roland is a curator at the Manitoba Museum, holds degrees in anthropology and a PhD in archaeology, and has some interests in material culture and the culture of the home. So I'm very happy to have you all join us for this discussion. The discussion in part comes from the work of Aileen, the editor of Preservings magazine, which is just about to print, or is currently printing, I believe, was rolling off the presses right now, a special edition devoted entirely to Mennonites and alcohol. So I'll turn it over to Aileen now. Maybe Aileen, you can give us a bit of a sense of why Mennonites and alcohol. What drew you to this theme? I note just before I started this webinar, and maybe I picked this up from someone else. If you go to Google and put in "can Mennonites," the autofill is "can Mennonites drink alcohol" is one of the top 5 choices, along with "can Mennonites or do Mennonites pay taxes in Canada?" So I'm not sure what the later one's about, but clearly there is some popular interest in this. So tell us a little bit about what got you started on the topic.
Thanks, Ben, for that introduction. So yes, this is the theme of our upcoming issue of Preservings, which is currently being printed and will be in the mailboxes of our subscribers soon. I can half blame Hans for this topic. I believe that I mentioned it to him, or we had a discussion about the potential of having this topic. Of course, Hans is the former editor of Preservings magazine, which is published by the Platt Foundation. And I, tentatively try to suss out whether this would be a good theme that we could have an issue about. And Hans seemed to think that it could work under the right circumstances. And it was interesting because part of this comes from, I was sitting in the Russian archives, or actually Ukrainian archives, and reading this material about Mennonites and wine in the early settlement in Hortica. And I thought, this is, very in-depth material that hasn't really been properly analyzed. And thankfully, Glenn Penner has an article in this upcoming issue that looks into production of alcohol in places like Hortica, and we also have another article that deals a little bit with Molochna. So this is an issue. The social, the religious, the economic aspects of alcohol production haven't been properly analyzed within the kind of historical field of studying Mennonites. And I thought, why not try a first attempt in preservings? And so that is where the impetus for this art, for the journal, the magazine, this issue of the magazine came from, and then it kind of spiraled into tonight's event.
Great, just unmuting there. So yeah, maybe I can start us off then with a few questions and an opportunity for the other members to introduce their topics. Of course, some of our audience members may not have had a chance to pick up Menno-Nightcaps yet, and they certainly haven't been able to flip through Preservings, which is just coming out. So Cherry, Hans, Roland, maybe take 3 to 4 minutes, 5 minutes to explain some of your approach to writing about Mennonites and alcohol, either in the book here, Sherry, or Hans and Roland in Preservings. And I'll add in just another element there. You all have different approaches, of course, grounded in many aspects in history, but Sherry, you make use of humor, of course, to draw attention to this theme. Hans, you engage in archival research of a format Aileen and I are familiar with. And Roland, you turn to material culture. There's some great images in Preservings as well. So tell us about what that particular approach maybe brings to the story after you introduce us to your area of focus. And we'll start with Sherry. And maybe Sherry, if we can trouble you, would you like to read us one of your, I guess I could call them recipe/history lessons from your book, and then that'll get us started.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, I don't actually think so. Here's the book. The book isn't actually about Mennonites and alcohol, right? It uses alcohol, it uses the cocktail recipes, but it is like Ben mentioned before, it's kind of an overview, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but I'll start with the reading because the reading is fun. So this one, the one I chose, is one of the few that is actually focused on Mennonites and alcohol. And so it's called the Vistula Daisy. And I'm just going to hold up the picture because it's also one I really actually like the picture that the publisher and the illustrator did for this one. So I say there was a time back in the mid 1700s in the Vistula Delta, that's around the city of Danzig, in what is now Poland, when Mennonites grew so famous for their liquors that the terms Mennonite and tavern keeper were practically synonymous. Sure, that was because Mennonites who had migrated there from the Netherlands were given limited occupational options by the Prussian government, and distilling was one of the few jobs open to them. But I say, when life gives you lemons, make a cocktail. The Prussian distillers were particularly known for their brandies. If you can get your hands on a Danziger Goldwasser, try substituting that for the brandy. I chose, actually, I didn't want to use alcohols that were hard to get a hold of, and also I couldn't get it. So I didn't make it with that. And then it goes on, and there's the recipe. I'm not going to actually read the recipe. It involves cognac and grenadine. I will show it to you, though. I made it for this occasion. It's pour cognac, grenadine, chartreuse, and lemon juice into a cocktail shaker, shake thoroughly, and serve in a julep cup or wine glass over crushed ice, and serve with a straw while lobbying your local Mennonites to take up the old tradition of tavern keeping. I did want to mention Ben said that he noticed me on Twitter first. The title, so the image, which I'm sure you can't see very well on this Zoom one, is of a tavern with like a kind of an old-fashioned like sort of a tavern sign, which is not historically accurate. I have no idea what the signs were like in Prussia, but I'm pretty sure they weren't like that. And but it's just meant to be humorous. And I kind of crowdsourced the title for the inn that went on Twitter with like ideas for names. And we had a number of them. I ended up going with Thirsty Martyr, which was a sort of amalgam of various other ideas. And if anybody wants, I went back into Twitter and got a list of them if everybody wants to hear about the sort of the runners up. Yeah, so introducing it, so yeah, I do feel like I'm kind of a little bit of an odd duck at this event, because it's not, like I said, it's not really a book about Mennonites and alcohol. It's a cocktail book, and it's a cocktail book with history, or a history book with cocktails. Sometimes I think it's sort of just whichever you prefer. Though Amazon and most bookstores seem to think that it's a cocktail book with history, not the other way around. And I kind of like, it's unusual. I guess that goes without saying, but it's even in the novelty cookbook realm, it's the first one. There's been like books that have been written sort of with literature or with like famous peoples, but that the first one that uses history isn't like great moments in Western history. It's like moments in Mennonite and Anabaptist history. I mean, I think we have great moments on our own, but I also think it's kind of funny that we get to claim that. I don't know how much you want me to keep talking. I think like I used up a fair bit of my 5 minutes with reading that cocktail, but because I was going to talk a little bit more about sort of how my like approach to history came into how I wrote the book, but I can also leave that later, Ben, if you don't want me to like sort of take up too much time right now.
Terry, go ahead. Yeah, give us another minute or two of your approach.
Yep. So my approach was somewhat defined by the format. And that I had to write in small little paragraphs like I just did, and was trying to cover 500 years of history, and which didn't bother me on one level. The way I was trained as a historian back in the early 90s was what we then call it was social history, and was sort of what was following what was the Annales school, which, some of you, the trained historians in the room would know it came out of France, but it was very much focused on long-term history, looking at things over centuries, long trends, and looking beyond sort of individuals and looking towards sort of broad societal forces. So what that means when you look at the book is I really kind of avoided just doing the great man history of Mennonite and Anabaptist history. There's a few cocktails that are named after leaders, but there's also a number that there are more that are named after sort of trends or broad things. And even where I do have like sort of I've got a Conrad Grebellini cocktail, which is obviously Conrad Grebel, one of the leaders. And then in the next page, I've got Margaret Hotting-Wallbanger, which is for Margaret Hottinger, who was also an Anabaptist at the time, but she's sort of not as commonly known. So it's kind of trying to be a little subversive that way. And I start with demography, which is a pretty, I think, unusual way for like telling the whole kind of Mennonite story. But I think that comes out of the way I was trained. And so I think it comes. What ends up, I kind of think it ends up with like a bit of a kaleidoscope. Is where Mennonite history. And I hope that people, I looked at how sort of my researching was not as deep as it would have been if it was a scholarly work, but it went a little bit beyond Gameo, but not much. And there, I hope, though, that there is at least a certain amount of accuracy, and that it kind of can be a lead-in. I was writing, hopefully, for a broad audience, so Mennonites, but also people who aren't Mennonites and who could find an interest in the Mennonite history, and also, obviously, I was trying to have a light tone to it and finding things that were amusing. Which I actually think is a good approach to history in general as well. But that's just me. Okay, I think that's where I'll
Support
end.
that approach, Sherry. Thank you.
Okay.
Let's jump over to Hans here. And Hans, tell us a bit about Winkler and a bit about the history you wrote, and again your approach. What materials might be available to historians to actually get at this topic?
Well, my article, which is going to be in Preservings, began as an undergraduate paper years ago, and then it got worked into when I wrote a history of Winkler. Parts of it got used there, and then now I reworked it again or did some more work. So it kind of had a long history of its own, and it is primarily, sort of based on looking at the newspapers, not exclusively, but looking at newspapers. And Winkler offers us a bit of a case history of Mennonites and the temperance movement, particularly, because in Winkler, you might say temperance is a sort of an 1880s, 1890s phenomenon going into World War I, more generally, and Mennonites never really joined temperance societies, but they were influenced by temperance. And some argue that long history of Mennonites and alcohol was only interrupted by this interlude of temperance. And so Winkler offers us an interesting kind of look into that. And while Winkler was influenced quite a bit by temperance, and the rest of Christian Canada abandoned it fairly quickly, but Winkler didn't. It lasted much longer in Winkler. So if you kind of looked at Winkler, you could sort of divide it up. Winkler was started in 1892, a railway town. 1892 to 1927, its population was dominated by German and Jewish businessmen and some Mennonites, and liquor referendums invariably voted wet in Winkler during those years. There were a number of them, and people in Winkler, there was apathy among the Mennonites and those that, and it was really the Berchthaler and Mennonite Brethren who were bought into temperance, and they were also the ones who lived in Winkler. So they were against it. They resisted an early, even in the first year of Winkler, to get a liquor license. They resisted that, and it got postponed, and they didn't get one right away. A hotel was eventually built, which became the only drinking establishment in Winkler for many, many years. And so in the period up to sort of in the 1920s, wet. Then for 30 years, nothing happened. It just went, the Stanley Hotel in Winkler was the place where you went for a beer. The 1927 referendum allowed for serving by the glass. And it did, ironically, allow for women and men to drink in a pub, but they had to be separate. They had to be in separate spaces. And there are, in fact, I don't think any pubs that had both. It was a men's only pub in Winkler and most other places. Then in 1957, there was another referendum. And in 1957, Winkler voted overwhelmingly dry. So that didn't change the Stanley Hotel's liquor license. They could still serve as they had, but it limited any expansion. And and the newspaper, if you follow the newspaper is very happy that Winkler voted dry. That seems to be the thing. And then for 30 years, nothing happens again. And then in the 1970s, you have a real go at this question. There's another liquorendum in 1971. It again is against, it does not favor opening up a liquor, but now the newspaper the newspaper editor is quite mortified at what happened. And I'm just reading here, he says, the editor of the Pembina Triangle Progress, Winkler's paper of the time, was bitter about the apparent defeat of the progress in the town. Now, voting against liquor is against progress. Whereas in the temperance era, voting for temperance was for progress. So it kind of flips. And so he's bitter about the apparent defeat of progress in the town. In an editorial, he says that the mellow taste of a good drink had given way to the bitter taste of defeat. So now the newspaper is on the other side of the question, advocating for opening up the liquor laws. But the debate gets quite acrimonious in the 1970s. There are a succession of liquor referendums. The new hotel owner wants to build a new hotel. He says progress, a better hotel, nicer facilities will be good for the town, and so he needs a liquor license for that. And they keep getting turned down. Just notice here, there's the same editorial. It's kind of interesting. The editorial in 1971 says, that Winkler people would now be forced to press for a 4-lane highway to neighboring Morden, so that the added lanes would make the 7-mile sojourn to the drinking and dining establishments of our neighboring backward town much more pleasant. In the 4-lane highway would eventually come, but not in 1971. So Morden starts to be the sort of the foil, and increasingly people are arguing that people in Winkler are just going to Morden to buy their liquor. They're voting against liquor in Winkler and then going to Morden to buy it. People from Morden chime into the newspaper about this and so on. So there emerges this sense that people in Winkler are actually not as much against alcohol as it appears. They're just going to Morden to buy it. And this is kind of reflected in a gradual decline in the number of people participating in referendums. And I sort of suggest that people maybe on a personal level were no longer so against alcohol, but couldn't bring themselves to cross over to actually indicate on a ballot, yes, I'm in favor. So they just kind of didn't go vote. And so in the 1970s till about 1985, especially in 1985, there's acrimonious debate about this as reflected in the newspapers. And then in 1991, we gradually, sort of from 1991 to 2003, gradually liquor starts to become an individual choice. And gradually the liquor laws are relaxed, and it ceases to be a community kind of question, in the sense that people are left to their own individual choices, and gradually and there is now a liquor store in Winkler, which would have been unheard of in 1957. Maybe that's enough for now.
It's a great intro, Hans. Thank you. Look forward to reading the whole article, and we'll turn on to Roland. Roland, I know from getting a peek at the magazine before it's come out, you've got some beautiful images of glassware and other things you looked at, material culture. I live along the Red River, and across the way, I think there used to be a distillery across from Norwood here, and I regularly see people on the banks looking for old glassware, I think, as well. It kind of emerges from the muck. So I was pretty curious about your work with the Mennonite Heritage Village. I believe the collection there, right, is where you were using for the article. So take it away and tell us about what we can glean from material culture about Mennonites and alcohol.
Yes, so I used to work at the Mennonite Heritage Village as the curator before Andrea Klassen, who's there now. And when I was there, I had noticed, I was working with the materials in the storage rooms, and I noticed a few shelves that had bottles. And so I would look at them and sort of see, here's a beer bottle, and here's some medicine bottles, and here's something that looks like, a liquor bottle. But never really did too much with it. And then I did an archaeological excavation, that's my background is in archaeology, at Blumenhof, which is just east of where Blumenort is now. And we were finding some fragments of bottles there as well. And so I started comparing them with what was in the MHV collection. And quickly came to realize that we were seeing gin bottles and medicine bottles and a lot of ginger beer bottles as well. And so this is a site where people had been drinking something at some point. And so when Aileen told me about the topic for this preservings, I got very excited about these bottles again and thought, well, here I could do something. So I took a day and went back to the MHV, and Andrea let me look into the collections. And I just basically wrote down what was there and looked into who had donated it and when, took photographs, and a picture started to form of Mennonites of the past and what they were drinking. And this is looking just at the materials themselves. And, you know, each of these bottles has a history as well. They come from an era, they come from a place. And when you do that research, you start to get this picture of where Mennonites are getting their alcohol and their, I guess, sources from. And one thing that really struck me was that the medicines, the alcohols, even the vanilla extract, which was so popular, the beer, it's all being made in Winnipeg. Even though the similar types are being sold around the country, these are all locally made. And so Mennonites are either getting them, you know, imported into stores in Steinbach, or they're going to Winnipeg themselves to buy them. And it's really you get all kinds of alcohol too. It's not limited to one kind. So we have these beautiful square bottles called gin case bottles, and they're sort of greenish, squared and tapered bottles, and they're made to fit in a case together really well and use up all the available space in there, and that's why they're square. And these are popular from the 1870s to the 1920s, and they're an example of gin drinking. We also have at the MHV 2 large glass Bright's wines bottles. And Bright's was a winemaker in Ontario, and for a number of years they were the biggest makers of wine in the British Empire. Now, they didn't make wine you would want to drink at your table. They made port, mostly for churches and communion. So essentially bad wine, but strong. And there are two giant jugs of this at the MHV, and these are from two churches in Steinbach. You also have beer bottles made locally, and then ginger beer, which is now out of fashion, but in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, it was very fashionable to drink ginger beer because it was fairly low alcohol content. It was about, well, I don't know if they knew exactly how much it was, but between 2 and 3%. So it was something that was drinkable, wouldn't get you hammered necessarily, but it tasted good. And we find those kinds of bottles all over the place too. And then we move into the medicines. And in the late 19th, early 20th century, every kind of snake oil was out there. They had alcohol in them, but they also had opiates. They had cocaine in them. I mean, these were not safe things to drink. And they promised the world in terms of health. And Mennonites were drinking this stuff. And so there's lots of evidence of that. And there were some favorites. There was something called Forney's, and there were some wonder oils that, you know, had high alcohol contents, which were both for external and internal use. There was one that was 69% alcohol, and there were instructions on the label on how to give it to your children to drink. You know, none of this is safe or good, but it's all out there and available to people in different ways. And then vanilla extract. So this was a vanilla extract was something that was available in the stores in Steinbach. It was 34% alcohol. And of course it was for baking, but there were people who were drinking it for other purposes as well. And with all of these types of alcohol, whether it was just a 2% beer or whether it was a high alcohol baking material, it was all available, right, in the stores and in your homes. And that's one thing to remember about Mennonites and alcohol, is that this wasn't always some secretive thing that was off to the side. This was stuff that was everywhere. Now, how you drank it and how you showed your drinking might be different in a Mennonite context, but certainly it was available.
Thanks for that description, Roland. So I will take over asking at least one question. And it's very interesting. We have a diversity of approaches to the issue of alcohol on this panel, and then also in preservings, the upcoming preservings. But we also have a diversity of locations that are covered in preserving. So in preservings, we have an article about Danzig, we have about Imperial Russia, we have a Manitoba represented by the East Reserve with Roland, the West Reserve with Hans. But I wanted to ask Ben Nobbs-Thiessen a question about the Latin American experience and what we can glean from that experience about Mennonites' interaction and relationship with alcohol.
Thanks, Aileen. Well, if I'm put on the spot, I'll deliver it. I have to admit, reading through preservings, I kind of regretted that I hadn't devoted more of my own research focus to the question of Mennonites and alcohol in Latin America. Certainly, my anecdotal experience doing field work there, I did kind of get a perception that well frowned upon, invisible locations, public locations, consumption of alcohol was relatively normal for Mennonites. I remember taking a shared taxi with a group of Mennonites to a large auction in Bolivia where people were going to spend the day bidding on different machinery. And we pulled over at a small store on the edge of a colony on the way out. And I wasn't sure what we were doing. And the man I was traveling with came back with, a beer for myself, him, and his son-in-laws. I think it was about 10:30 in the morning. So it was a bit early, but I think the festive nature of the auction experience sort of lent itself to the license there. And the fact that he kind of picked it up from one of those stores was also indicative of the way in which alcohol was marketed often on the peripheries of Mennonite colonies, which were large blocks of land. There would typically be stores run by Bolivians. And I talked to some of those store owners and they noted, that occasionally there would be sort of a stern talking to if there was a sense that youth from the colonies were purchasing this from a particular store. More broadly, I think there are elements to which perhaps negative perceptions around alcohol are at times part of the discussion of traditional colonies in Latin America. If you see popular representations, I think there was a National Geographic special which sort of documented this, especially drinking among youth in Mennonite colonies. On the flip side, for Mennonites in some regions of Latin America, perceptions of their neighbors, indigenous or non-indigenous, sometimes hinge on questions of alcohol consumption. So Mennonites in Paraguay at times reflected on the use of pods from a particular tree, the algaroba, among the Enlet in the Paraguayan Chaco to produce a type of beer, and definitely attempted to dissuade them away from this annual gathering and this festivity that it was involved in. But I had to go to kind of the sources because I didn't have a lot of detail about Mennonites and alcohol in the Paraguayan Chaco. So I checked with our archivists, Gundolf Niebuhr in Fernheim colony and Patrick Friesen in Menno colony. So I'll just note some of the responses. I was asking Patrick because I was under the impression that the Privilegium specifically prohibited the sale of alcohol within 5 kilometers of Menno colony. And Patrick noted that was the case and there were restrictions. At times they were enforced by the congregation initially, but that later the cooperative itself started to sell spirits, predominantly to churches for the celebration of communion. He says that sales were restricted and, quote, dosed, so no consumer could buy large amounts of alcohol. So there was an attempt to kind of control that. He's going to get back to me with more details. As far as the Russian Mennonites, which helped found Fernheim, Gundolf Niebuhr says it's a complex question. There was never a total prohibition in Fernheim, and it was also sold in the co-op at times. But there were bouts, he says, of Puritanism, where the Commission for Church Affairs would protest and it would be sold more secretively. He notes that from the 90s onwards, there's such a diversity of groups living within the colony that there's really no specific rules or restrictions at present. So we get an interesting perspective there. And I'll leave off with that. There's a great article I'll just note in Preservings by Kenneth Giesbrecht as well, which discusses the idea about recovery centers, which were for Mennonites suffering from alcoholism, which were pioneered, and other forms of substance abuse, pioneered in Mexico and then transplanted to Bolivia. And indeed, when I first visited Bolivia on, I think, my initial trip in 2011, they had just opened the Guia, or they were fundraising for Guia de Paz, which is one of the rehabilitation centers for Mennonites, about 40 kilometers east of Santa Cruz. So maybe we should take a few questions from the audience. Aileen, do you see any in the Q&A you want to turn to now?
Let's turn to this one by Andrew Unger, writing under Aaron's name. Andrew asks, I found your history of alcohol in Winkler very interesting, Hans, and definitely found parallels to where I live in Steinbach. Do you think there's any reason why the wider, say for instance, Winnipeg media has given Steinbach much more attention regarding referendums and so on, while Winkler has remained under the radar on these issues?
I'm not sure about that. I mean, I know that Steinbach has kind of a parallel history. There always was the tourist hotel in Steinbach, which was a men's only parlor as well. And I grew up in Steinbach, so I remember vividly, the tourist hotel and the pub. But I don't know why, I mean, I think, Winkler had its own day in the sun off and on, but Steinbach's closer to Winkler, and maybe that's one of the reasons why Steinbach has maybe had more press in Winnipeg. I don't know who went first. I know the France Motor Inn on the outskirts of Steinbach was close enough that, it could have a liquor license and really was on the edge of town. Whereas in Winkler is surrounded by the Arm of Stanley, where Morden 7 miles away was the closest place. So I don't know, there's parallels, but they're both a little different, I think.
A question, if I could throw in here for Roland. I was interested in looking at these different receptacles for the tonics and the other things like that, and then the wine. Do you get any idea of maybe that these vessels were reused for subsequent purposes or refilled with other products that were distilled?
It's quite possible. It's really impossible to say though. For the bigger ones, I think it would be like there's some quite large ceramic jugs out there. I would think they would be reused for something. For the very small ones, for the medicine bottles, I'm not sure. They might have just been collected or chucked even. And again, in the archaeological excavations, there were plenty of bottles and fragments in there, all broken. And so they were just clearly rejected at some point, but their history sticks with them.
Can I ask a question?
Yes,
Yeah.
please.
So I wonder about domestic production, like, dandelion wine has like this kind of mythic sort of historic, like in my sort of Menno universe, that people talk about it, that just people making it at home. And it's sort of like, I know your sources, like I don't know if you can tell what's your sense about how much. I wondered that particularly about the Winkler bands. It's like, yeah, we don't want it in hotels, but we're like making our own stuff in the back quarter. That's just because I read the little question that was popping up that I said colony. But any sense, are there any other sources that we can look to see what kind of sort of what's happening at home?
I have one. And that's in Neubergtal. There are some very, very healthy, very old hop vines growing there, used for brewing beer. And they've been there for many, many decades. We don't know exactly how long, but they're there every year and they're ready to be used. So they keep coming back.
I do recall a story from an elderly grandmother south of Winkler who said, and I don't know exactly the time frame, but when inspectors came, this Mennonite lady had such a big skirt and was a big lady that she could take all the pipes under her skirt when the inspector came to check about whether there was distillation going on. So that's obviously purely anecdotal. I don't know if a real source, but.
We've got a couple questions here, sort of related. The first from Eleanor Larkentine says, what does the Bible say about drinking alcohol? Or I'll re-ask that question, what parts of the Bible might have been used by Mennonites who wanted to discourage drinking? And then Bob Weeb asks similarly, how is the official view of the church, for example, the Kirke and its offspring bodies, changed over time? So I don't know if anyone wants to respond to that, perhaps Hans.
You know, it's interesting to read in the early temperance literature in Manitoba, you know, which did arise to some extent out of, you know, Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian churches, where the most affinity for temperance was. And, you know, there's a, you know, Thompson, there's a fellow by the name of Thompson who has an MA on alcohol prohibition in Manitoba. And he says, you know, one minister denied the fact that, you know, Jesus actually made wine, alcoholic wine, that it was just grape juice. And they advocated that even at communion, it should not be wine. It should be unfermented grape juice. You know, so the temperance movement, when it got to total abstinence, would even suggest, for instance, that the Bible justified total abstinence by this bit of a leap to suggest that even it hadn't really been fermented alcohol or, you know, fermented grape juice, which I think probably was a bit of a leap. But that was the temperance movement was very, you know, used the Bible to suggest that you know, abstinence really was the only position. Now, the Lutheran pastor in Winkler, for instance, eventually was driven in the 1970s to respond, and he, of course, said that you know, the Bible doesn't ever support abstinence, particularly. It does support moderation, and certainly that was the position of the Lutheran Church. But the Berchthaler and MB churches gradually in the 1880s and 1890s adopted a pretty strong sense of abstinence, particularly the Mennonite Brethren Church was probably more abstinence oriented, the Berchthaler a little more temperance oriented rather than total abstinence. I don't know if that helps, but that's some thoughts on it.
Well, I mean, the old story, I mean, I wrote a blog post about it, and I had people like write in with, give me actual like evidence. And you included the picture, right, of the, in the poster for this is of a pig butchering with like somebody having like vodka on the side, because that was, and there is evidence that the MB church, that some of the leaders of the original MB church, that it was the excessive drinking at pig butchering parties was one of the many things that the Kirche, you know, did wrong, that pushed it. I mean, I made a joke out of it because I like, in when I wrote the blog post about it, I made it as if like that was the primary thing, where of course there were many other things, but I mean, it was there. You know, even if it wasn't the main thing, it still was a thing with the MB church, even in Russia, in the like late 1840s, wasn't it? Somebody nod and give me yes, that's right, isn't it? 1940s?
1860s is when we'll get the MB schism.
That's what I meant.
And I'll just add on to Sherry's comment. Yeah, so obviously alcohol was one of the issues with the formation of the Mennonite Brethren Church in Russia. It was also an issue that was identified by the Kleine Gemeinde in their early schism. And we have an article in the upcoming issue of Preservings by Benjamin Wiebe from Germany, who looks at the schism in Russia and the response. And there's been he does very interesting research on the ways in which alcohol was then debated subsequently in Mennonite newspapers in Russia, and the sort of introduction of abstinence and the relationship between Mennonites and German pietists, and the kind of revival meetings that were taking place during this period. And it really sort of fleshes out that story of the role of alcohol in this religious break within the Mennonite community.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, those kinds of debates, which were social morality debates, theological debates, you know, it's really important to keep those in a certain perspective, because at the same time, people are still drinking. You know, they're still doing their hog slaughtering and still drinking brandy. And so that's where the debate's around, right? It's about daily practice or you know, weekly practice of drinking, and how does our society work with that? How do we surmount that? How do we change that, or should it stay the same?
To
And
be fair, hog butchering was not a daily or a weekly.
Right.
thing.
It's an annual thing. It's November, October, I guess. And there's a great picture from Neubergtal that's in preservings as well. And there's 2 bottles going in that one. And from oral histories I did many years ago, I remember somebody discussing drinking brandy at the hog butchering in Neubergtal. So that's the Canadian experience of that. But I could imagine, how that might have been a bit comforting because it's cool out there and you've got a lot of work to do, and why not celebrate? Although they're also working with sharp knives, so it seems dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember the butchering days, Roland, as a 6-7-year-old with the big wooden thing you used to push the meat into the grinder. So yeah, certainly I want to be careful with the tools applied. I had a question for Sherry from Roy Lowen, and kind of had a similar question of mine too. But Roy says, did you ever worry that all the sober, somber, serious Mennonites might not get your book? Or we could perhaps rewrite that as, what's the role of humor and the challenges of humor at approaching this subject? Thanks, Roy, for that question.
Yeah. I expect there are some, but we're also kind of non-confrontational, so they've been pretty quiet. So I probably, I've been writing a blog since 2013, I think. And at the beginning, and that was a Mennonite cocktail blog. And at the beginning, I was sort of concerned about this stuff, and there was just enough positive reaction that I didn't. There's still people who are who don't want to buy it because they don't drink. And I like to point out that there's a whole section at the back for how to make these non-alcoholic, and also you can just buy it for the history. I mean, I actually do get the date right in it about when the Mennonite Brethren wrote, even if I can't right now. So there's my argument. If there are people who don't like the humor, I don't know. It hasn't been a reaction. So I do think we tend to take ourselves pretty seriously, and we tend to take our history pretty seriously. But so far, it seems like people don't mind having a break from all that seriousness every now and then. So yeah, I stopped worrying about it at a certain point.
Aileen, since you put me on the spot, maybe I'll return the favor. Is there any sense in the Russian context how, given what we see in preservings, the massive amount of revenue that distilling might have produced for some colonies, how the revolution and subsequent period might have shifted production or consumption for Russian Mennonites in the 1920s and beyond?
Yeah, well, obviously everything gets taken eventually underneath state control. So I can't speak to the what happens to individual distilleries. There's also sort of this new social revolution, right, in the sense that previously, and many of the panelists have probably read David Epps' diary of the minister from Russia, and he talks a lot about disciplining people for alcohol consumption within the church. Well, that disciplinary structure, once the revolution happens, gets diminished, right, within Mennonite communities. That will take place during the 1920s and then be solidified during the 1930s, when there is a strong push by the Soviet regime to crack down on religion. And so then it becomes more of a personal choice of how you interact with alcohol, instead of a choice that is being in part made for you through the community. And I know that there was one question here about the idea of alcohol in Russia and how widespread it was. In Imperial Russia, distilleries, there was a distillery in Hortitsa, there were breweries, it was brought into a lot of revenue into Mennonite colonies because Mennonites could control their alcohol production and sales. That was spelled out in the Privilegium that Paul I signed. And so there was really, I don't want to say vibrant, but there was a lot of alcohol being at least produced, or at least some being produced, and the idea of consumption of alcohol was accepted. Obviously, the Mennonite Brethren will have their own ideas about what is acceptable, but there were taverns that Mennonites would go to, and then when it was people drank to excess, then it was disciplined by the ministerial council. And obviously there was also issues of alcoholism, right? What we identify now as alcoholism, which they at that point didn't really have the language to define. So that is also takes place within Russia.
And just, you know, if you read the Jacob F. diaries and the David F. diaries, it is astounding. I mean, you know, one would not want to minimize the problems of abuse. They were considerable in the sense that, you know, if you look at the disciplining, it's a lot.
I'll add in their question from Linda-Thiessen, asking about consumption patterns between urban and rural regions. So there's references to urban and rural and Sherry's collection here, and clearly we see with fans of Roland, whether it's where these products are coming from, like in Winnipeg, or the urban restrictions in Winkler. What is your sense of that? What does it mean in terms of limits or opportunities, I suppose, for alcohol consumption, whether you're in a village or moving into a city for Mennonites?
Go, Roland.
Oh, sure. Well, certainly in the city, you have a better chance of anonymity, right? When you go to a pool hall, the lowest of the low, or you know, a bar or a restaurant, you're not necessarily going to be seen by your neighbors. And so, but if you're doing that in a small town, in a rural area, there's every chance you'll be seen by your neighbors. So I think that there's a lot of potential sort of self-repression going on in that sense about how much you're drinking or what occasions you're drinking. But you know, like the bottles I was looking at, people are getting the stuff from Winnipeg. So if they're going to an urban center, they're going to pick something up and bring it home, and they can do that anytime if they have an automobile or you know, they're going with somebody or somebody picks it up for them. So lots of, you know, rural urban divide is not absolute. There's, you know, you're going into these centers all the time. It's available.
If you think about the temperance question, that's often considered that the people who were against prohibition came from rural areas, primarily in southwestern Manitoba, where the British Methodist Presbyterian concentration was, you know, was the strongest in those. And French Canadians, Catholics, and Mennonites were considered to be against prohibition. And Thompson, in his MA thesis, argues that you know, the Nobbs-Thiessen, for instance, the German language newspaper, said it was because Mennonites, in the case of Mennonites, because Mennonites resisted the imposition of state control over their lives, and this was just another state control question. That's what the Nobbs-Thiessen argues. So you know, in that sense, it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition of who's in favor of temperance and who's not.
I'll just, this isn't really in my book, but one of the sort of in my current professional role where I work in the sociology instead of in history, it's one of the things in sort of the addictions literature now is that it kind of depends on the role that alcohol plays in terms of in terms of its role for addictions, and like why you are drinking. And if you are drinking, like, yes, if you're going to the pool hall, if you are like, I don't know, pool hall, but anyway, it's mostly if you're drinking to escape or if you're drinking for pleasure, and there's a different sort of outcome. So that I think might be sort of interesting too, when we look at historically the role of alcohol. It's how is it, you know, are people having a glass of dandelion wine with their, you know, with all their Freundschaft? Is it part of a celebration, the pig butchering, or is it part of something you're doing like out of shame, that you're going and you just, yeah, you're trying to escape sort of the confines of your community or something, that may be an element worth exploring in terms of not just that it's there, but in terms of the impact that it has.
Question for Aileen from the Q&A. What opportunities, I suppose, were there for women to consume alcoholic beverages in Russia? Would this be in taverns or at home?
Well, one of the times that people went to consume alcohol was when they were going to the market. And so you would go to the market and you'd kind of be away from places and you could do other things. Most of the times in which I've seen disciplinary action, and Hans can correct me on this, on that, it has been a group of young men who are being disciplined for alcohol consumption. The issue of gender is actually fascinating and is one that we don't get into a lot in this issue of preservings. And I think that there's a lot of work that still needs to be done as to how gender roles played out. Hans made reference to the taverns being men-only spaces in Winkler. There's definitely this added element of women. This is not part of acceptable behavior, but in terms of how that actually played out in Russia and in terms of alcohol consumption, I'm afraid I don't have a good answer for that, but it's an area that we really need to spend more time thinking about.
I think in the EP diaries there's the odd, at least you could infer that, you know, in certain celebrations, maybe having to do with weddings and so on, that possibly women also consumed alcohol to a level that was required disciplinary action. But it's never as clear. As you say, it's always, you know, they reprimand people for his excessive drinking. I don't think you have any instances where she is reprimanded for her excessive drinking, even though there are some inferences that maybe that happened as well, but it's never that clear.
We're just about at the end of our session here. I don't know if any of the panelists have any final thoughts they want to weigh in on before we wrap up here.
I might just make a comment that everyone is represented in the preservings issue, even Sherry, because her book is reviewed in our upcoming preservings. So if you want more information about anything that has taken place on this panel, be sure to pick up that issue.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, I'd like to, oh, was there a comment there?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks to Preservings for allowing all those photographs to be published of all the different liquor bottles. It was a nice photo essay, I think. So I think people could be interested.
Great. Well, everyone, thank you so much for taking part in this panel. Take a look at the new preservings, subscribe, pick up a copy of Menno-Nightcaps, and keep us in mind for our upcoming CTMS events. We're really grateful to the audience members. I think, just because I don't know if everyone can see it, we have about 115 or so in the room here, so pretty good turnout for a Thursday evening. And with that, I guess we'll say goodnight. Whether you head out for a nice healthful walk with the dog or end the evening with a Menno-Nightcap, wishing you good night from Winnipeg, and take care.